Great, well thank you so much for joining us here today for our In Conversation with David Lammy and Lisa Nandy. I hope you're all having a brilliant Labour conference so far. So today's event is co-hosted by the Labour Campaign for International Development, the Coalition for Global Prosperity and the Labour Foreign Policy Group. If you'd like to tweet along, please do. Our Twitter handles are @LabourCID, @BritainLeads, and @LabourFPG. You'll also get a chance to ask your own questions, both David and Lisa, so do get thinking if there's anything you want to ask. And I think we can tell by the number of people here, there's a lot of interest in hearing from you both and from those trying to get in the room. So we are honoured to have not one, but two of Labour's best and brightest campaigners and communicators with us today, who you will have no doubt seen on the airwaves holding this government to account. We of course have David Lammy, who is the Member of Parliament for Tottenham, is a fellow long-suffering Spurs supporter like myself, and is of course the Shadow Foreign Secretary. We also have Lisa Nandy MP, who is a Member of Parliament for Wigan. She currently heads up Labour's incredibly important international development brief and has held a number of roles in the Shadow Cabinet, including Levelling Up and Shadow Foreign Secretary. So thank you both for joining us, especially having legged it straight over from the main stage.
No, it's great to be here. Very, very important. Thank you.
Before we get into our questions, I think an event on foreign policy, we have to address the situation in Israel. So would you like to come in and comment on the situation? Perhaps David, I'll come to you.
Look, waking up on Saturday morning with my phone buzzing because of the messages coming in and then turning on the television screens, seeing young people fleeing from a rave. You know, once upon a time I used to go to raves.
One time ago.
People taken hostages, murders. It was very clear to assert and to remind people about Hamas being a prescribed terrorist organisation and about the importance of Israel able to defend itself. All of us care a lot about peace in the Middle East, and you know, the two-state solution that we hold dear, we've got to hold on to, and that's why I repeated that this morning in my speech. But clearly, it does feel a little distant, and it's hugely important that those hostages are released. And that the tyranny and terrorism that is being experienced by Israel comes to an end.
Lisa, is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I absolutely support David, and I think it was clear in the hall where we've just both run across from in the foreign policy debate how much people care about this issue in our movement, how much they have been moved by seeing some of the images that have emerged of young people who just went to have a good time at a music festival. We've got people in our movement who are worried about family currently, don't know where they are desperately afraid of what the potential repercussions are. And I think it's absolutely right that we speak with one voice as a movement when we say we stand with people against terrorism.
And what do you think... And what do you think we need to see next from the international community?
Well, look, none of us want to see increased bloodshed on both sides. We understand that there's got to be an operation. You know, there are still hostages away from their homes and their families. And it's important that that act is proportionate and with international law. All of us have seen the numbers of the loss of life of Israelis and indeed of Palestinians. And this has been an appalling year for loss of life of Palestinians. So our party is a party that holds out the candle of peace. And we want to see, if we come to government, the UK playing its role once more to do all we can to bring about peace to that region.
Now I want to take us forward to next year, and a general election has taken place, and let's say Labour have won a majority, and you're coming in as the Foreign Secretary and the International Development Minister. Firstly, what will be your top priorities in the first 100 days? And secondly, what will we see change from a Conservative foreign policy we've had over the past decade? Do you want to come first, David, then Lisa, I'll come to you?
Well, look, let me bring the central message. It's very, very simple, and it can be boiled down to one or two words. We have to reconnect with the international community. It means reconnecting with our partners, our friends, our allies in Europe, and Europe plays a hugely important role globally in international development. So it's not just Emmanuel Macron and France leading the way, for example, on changes to rules on climate finance. We need to reconnect with the global south after a period in which we have slashed the aid budget and then finding ourselves spending a significant proportion of what's left on housing folk in hotels in our own country. And we need to be out there again, leading in terms of reform of MDBs, leading and present in the debates on the climate emergency and climate finance, leading on changing the rules around debt to benefit poor people once again across the world. I am proud, hugely proud, of the work begun by Robin Cook, who hoped to be our Foreign Secretary all those years ago, and Claire Short, who hoped to be our International Development Secretary all those years ago. And our job is very simple, to pick up that baton and get serious about the UK reconnecting once more.
I've just realised that when I clap, it makes the sound system go crazy, so sorry about that. I'm 3.5 weeks into the job, and I've just come back from New York, where the world was gathering to try to maintain some progress towards the global goals and some hope for people in every part of the world. And it was quite a sobering experience, because every room I walked into was full of passionate, incredible people, mostly women, making the clear case for why the world has to come together to deal with climate change, poverty, levels of indebtedness and conflict, making that case with passion and commitment, largely to world leaders who just weren't there. And in that week, as David said in his speech, Rishi Sunak not only became the first Prime Minister in a decade not to turn up, but he spent that week, in Climate Week, at UNGA, trashing our record on net zero and unravelling the commitments that we've made. So I absolutely support David's ambition that we're going to be the Labour government that reconnects Britain with the world, and we do it for a purpose. I know that over the last decade, it's been incredibly difficult. It's been most difficult for some of the poorest people on the planet, but it's been difficult for a lot of you as well. I know that you've watched with dismay and despair as the government has not just taken the axe to the aid budget and to the department, but also to an agenda that was one of the greatest contributions that Britain made to the world, and trashed the whole agenda in the public mind with those disgraceful comments about DFID being a giant cash point in the sky. What I heard most of all, though, in New York is this absolute determination that we are going to come together to solve the world's problems. I met with Mia Motley, incredible woman, Prime Minister of Barbados, who is pioneering the Bridgetown initiative. She didn't want to know from us at what point we're going to return to 0.7. She wanted to know that we were going to bring the same energy and commitment to this agenda that we brought in 1997, but to a completely changed world. And that's why I said in the hall today that we're going to seek a new relationship with our partners in the Global South, and it'll be characterised by one word: respect. We respect the contribution that they have to make. We know that they know better than we do the problems that they face and the solutions that they need. They don't just need aid and charity. They need a place, a seat at the table where the decisions are being made, particularly in terms of the reform of those global institutions that are currently unable to rise to meet this moment of dealing with climate change and indebtedness and conflict and poverty, extreme poverty in every part of the world. And the approach that we'll take to international development will be characterised by two things. One is the need that is out there and where the most pressing need is. But the second is about where Britain can play its full part and make the biggest contribution. We play an outsized role in the global finance system and in the debt that is currently owed because of the City of London. And David and I believe that there are levers that we can pull in this new era, different to the last era. In 1997, our economy was twice the size of China's. And much of the debt that was owed to countries like ours. But by taking a seat at the table again, by playing our full part in those multilateral institutions, by showing real thought leadership again in this field, by bringing together our convening power that we have as the United Kingdom, we can help people like Mia Motley put rocket boosters under the reform and campaigning agenda that she's pioneering. And we can start to show genuine respect and build partnerships with countries across the world again.
Well, you both touched on it there. One of the things that has troubled us most of the Labour campaign for international development has been the way in which this government have seemingly turned their back on the world's poorest at the very worst moment. You've both spoken a bit about a new model of international development that Labour would bring. Could you flesh this out a bit for us? And also specifically on the point, David, you mentioned about, at the moment, a large portion of the overseas aid budget is being spent domestically by the Home Office. Is that something that Labour would look to undo if they came into government?
Well, look, we're having this conversation at a time when if you are living in poverty in a developing country, there's a sense that countries like ours, and it's not just the UK, are turning their back on those in extreme poverty around the world. That given what we see in Afghanistan, in Yemen, in Sudan, in Chad, in a range of countries across the world, the scale of global hunger, 800 million people hungry as we speak, 129 million people displaced across the world, that the West largely is turning its back. This is not 1997. China is playing an outsized role, and its Belt and Road Initiative is a reality across the world. And the truth is that interest rates in our own country, inflation, a cost of living crisis is real. We have stasis on the Security Council of the UN. But that is a call to the Labour Party to step up. It's a call for the kind of leadership that we saw from Tony Blair and especially Gordon Brown. We have to get back to that kind of leadership in the world. We have to find new and renewed resources. So it's a scandal what is happening to our aid budget. It's an absolute scandal. And it's why we have to work in such close partnership with Yvette Cooper. It's why we've been saying what we've been saying about the botched way they've done processing, the way they're not working with European partners, because you can't do this on your own, and some of the fanciful stuff that our Prime Minister's saying about small boats, so that we aren't spending that money, basically, on hotel bills. And we're really, really clear about that. And when we talk about that new model, we are acutely aware of the evidence base that DFID have, the use of real empirical evidence to underpin what we're doing, the qualitative and quantitative work that was just shot to bits when they abandoned that department. We need to bring that back. Poverty is real, and we want the same agenda for people who are poor wherever they are in the world. The same agenda we want here. Growth. Growth. And we will use also where we are pioneers and innovative, and I think of our National Health Service. We are a country with some of the strongest higher education in the world. To stand beside countries that want partnership. Both Lisa and I have heritage that comes from the global south. Indian heritage. I have an Indian great-grandmother, by the way. You can tell by the eyebrows, apparently. And of course, I'm very proud to be of African descent, with family living in the country of Guyana and people who have not got a lot of money. So we understand that context. And we understand a world in which people want genuine partnership, not handouts. So it's that dignity that we talk about when we think about that new model.
I'm going to check my eyebrows in the mirror before I leave to see if they're particularly Indian or not. But it does matter, actually, I think, that you've got two people sitting here who are absolutely proud to have grown up in this country, British to the core, proud of our country, will stand up to defend it, but connected to the rest of the world through deep roots that run through our family history and our DNA. And I think that's one of the reasons why we see this agenda so similarly, as well as being great friends and for a long time, over a long period. We represent very different parts of the country, but also parts of the country where people have really struggled and really suffered, but have always shown solidarity with people on the other side of the world. And we're determined that we're going, as David said, to carry that baton, to take that torch forwards on behalf of a labour movement that's always understood that the world beyond our shores shapes the lives that we lead here in the UK to a really significant extent. I think I would just, to come back to your original question about how we go about dealing with extreme poverty. I think what worries me most in many parts of the world, I visited Palestine not very long ago, met some of the children in a refugee camp, is the absence of hope that things are going to change. And that was the power of the leaders of the Global South that Gordon introduced me to in New York, people like Mia Motley and many others besides, is that they are determined that there has to be hope on the horizon again, and we're determined that a Labour government will stand with them in order to create that. But as David said, that isn't just about providing some of the things that many of you here in this room will be providing, and rightly so, about the aid that comes into conflict zones immediately after conflict, about food, about access to water and wash facilities, about vaccinations. These things matter, they will always matter to a Labour government. But so too does good jobs and wages and trade and livelihoods, and the women who currently can't access credit in many parts of the world because they're women. But if they could, imagine what they could do. And actually, I don't have to imagine what they could do. In New York, I met a young engineer from Ghana, thanks to fantastic NGO WaterAid. She was one of only 6 girls in her village to finish secondary school. Why? Because of the lack of hygiene and sanitation facilities. So she not only finished secondary school, she went on to qualify as an engineer, and then she came back and she's running WaterAid's programme in Ghana, and she's made sure that every school has the facilities that they need, and she's transforming the educational prospects of those young people. Why is that so significant? Not just for them, not just because morally that's the right thing to do, so those young people can stay and contribute and share in the proceeds of that success. But it's important because that is the future of the country. That is how we're going to help those economies to rebuild. That is how we're going to help countries, not just to mitigate climate change, but to adapt and get on the front foot with access to clean energy technology so that they can share in the success of the coming revolution, not just us. And that's the sort of transformative system change that we're really interested in. You know, when I went to New York, I met with the Ford Foundation and the World Bank, and they said to me, I said it's a daunting challenge to meet the finance gap to get us to progress on the global goals. And they said it would cost 4 trillion to achieve the global goals. We're spending 8 trillion at the moment. That means we've got to think about how we do things differently, and we make sure that we're focusing on empowering and enabling people in every part of the world to create the system change that is going to mean that in the future they're producing the leaders and the innovators who are going to solve the world's challenges. You know, not just us coming in to tell people how to do it, and we certainly have something to offer on that. Just look at the malaria vaccine in Oxford, and I'm proud that we do, but we have something to gain as well from this. And it's a genuinely exciting moment where the world's got to decide. We've got to decide, is this the moment that we're going to step up and build the future, or are we going to be the last government to hang on to the past? Well, I know the answer to that from Labour, and I'm determined that we're going to be it.
That's a round of applause. Final question from me, because I'm sure we've got lots in the audience. You mentioned you were in New York recently, Lisa, and David, you, of course, lived and studied in the States. I want to ask you your thoughts on next year's US elections. And specifically, how would a Labour government work with a potentially incoming Trump administration? David, do you want to try that one first?
In all seriousness, you know, I know that we're in political season. There will be a lot of up and down in our own country before our general election, and there will certainly be a lot of up and down in the United States before their general election. Our relationship with the United States is deep and sustained, and in most areas we have common interests. And that is largely because of the underpinning of defence, security and foreign policy interests that bring us together. And the truth is, just as Wilson worked with Nixon, Macmillan worked with Kennedy, it goes beyond political party. It's for the American people to determine who they want to be in the White House. We will work in partnership, and we will play our role in leadership and influencing our closest of allies.
I couldn't support David more on that. You know, last time Donald Trump was in the White House, the security and defence relationship that we've always had with the United States was incredibly strong. Our mayors here in the UK work very, very closely with mayors across the whole of the United States. They are the people who are leading action on climate change, even at times when we have governments on both sides of the Atlantic who are rolling back progress. They are advancing it. And those relationships matter, they're deep, they're strong, and it's important, as David says, when he is Foreign Secretary, and I hope to God in a year's time we're sitting here with David as our Foreign Secretary, first in a generation Labour cabinet, that we continue to work with countries around the world, whoever they choose to represent them, in order to advance Britain's interests. I think, you know, too much of what we've seen from the Conservative Party over the last few years has been performative, and we're not interested in that. We're interested in real change. People can't wait any longer for the sort of change that they need to see, and we're determined that they're not going to.
Great, well, we'll open up to questions. We've got Rosie's here with the microphone, so we'll take two at a time to get through quite a few. And if you could just say your name and who your question is directed to. So I will take Georgia in front there, and then we'll take Rob there.
Hi, I'm Claudia from the International Rescue Committee, and to surprise absolutely no one who knows me, I'm going to ask about women. So I wanted to hear from both of you actually about how you think your brief can advance gender equality. Specifically, Lisa, you mentioned kind of response in the immediate aftermath of armed conflict or humanitarian situations, and we know that there are incredible women leaders on the ground, but far too often they're not actually getting the funding they need to lead the response in their local communities, and we also know that they can best lead that response. So I've been interested to hear from you on that. And then David, in terms of the role that women can play in peace building. We know that peace processes are much more successful when women are at that table and are able to play a leadership role instead of just simply being consulted maybe at the end. So how Labour would lead that in their foreign policy to ensure that women play a really key and pivotal role in peace processes around the world. Thank you.
Could go to
Great, thank you very much. I'm Robert Yates, Director of the Global Health Programme at Chatham House. It's been very interesting to hear you mention this new development model, less on handouts and charity and much more about sort of respect, solidarity, partnerships. And I'm just wondering your thoughts, what that might mean in terms of developing, say, health and education sectors overseas. And maybe this being a great opportunity for an incoming Labour government to really help countries build their own welfare states.
100%.
Recognising that, our aid financing, sort of in monetary terms is going to have little impact in some of these big low middle income countries. But thinking about the history of the UK coming out of the Second World War, this is when we built our wonderful NHS. And with all the crises going on, this could be a great opportunity for an incoming Labour government to be thinking about how you can leverage more domestic financing to help countries build their own NHSs and education systems. So would that be something you'd be thinking of?
Thank you. So you've got one on women, gender equality and peace building, and one on this new model of development and helping countries to build their own welfare states. Do you want to come in on the women question?
I mean,
You could do both.
we're women, we can do it all. First of all, on this question of women, I've just come from the hall where I said that most of all, my priority in this job is going to be to put women and girls at the heart of every single thing that we do when it comes to international development. It's the right thing to do, but it's also the best way to go about rebuilding and reconstructing, whether it's public services or economies, building your way out of conflict, giving women a seat at the table, political power and voice, which I'm sure David can talk a bit more about, but not just rights on paper, but the means to exercise them as well. It's personal for me, but it is absolutely the right thing to do, and it's long overdue. I met up with David Miliband when we were in New York, and obviously, running the International Rescue Committee, spearheading the incredible work that you guys do. And he said to me, I said, are you, we're talking about feminist foreign policy, which David's done a lot of work on. And I said, are you a feminist organisation? And he said, we're not a feminist organisation. A sharp intake of breath. David, what do you mean? And he said, because it's not up to us to say that we're a feminist organisation. It's up to other people to judge whether we're a feminist organisation. So we're putting in place the approach and letting others decide whether we've done a good enough job. And I thought that was absolutely right and should characterise our approach in government as well. Keir and I are meeting with Bill Gates next week to talk about some of the ways in which we can open up access to credit and finance to women in developing countries, as well as advancing the vaccine and immunisation programme. We're really interested in things like some of the pioneering work that is being done to help with providing things like wash facilities that mean that women that no longer have to die in such great numbers in childbirth. We've got a whole series of interventions that we think we could usefully make, but the core of that is about empowering women and girls, not just providing things to them, but empowering them to be able to, like that young engineer in Ghana, to be able to make the changes that they want to see in their own countries, and us walking alongside them as partners as they achieve their ambitions, not ours. And just on this point about public services, I absolutely agree and support what you're saying. The long-term system change is about embedding that change. But there is a problem. And the leaders of developing countries that I met last week left me in absolutely no doubt about it. Unless you sort out the finance, what you're essentially saying to countries is, we want you to set up systems that you can't necessarily sustain. And so we've got to take a much more long-term strategic view about how we re-engineer the global finance system, so that when we do help those countries to achieve their ambitions, like we achieved the National Health Service and comprehensive education, that they can sustain those things into the future. They don't want false promises. They've heard a lot of it from successive governments. They want a real plan to be able to help them deliver on those ambitions.
Let me just say there are some significant areas of foreign and international development policy that have disappeared under this government, that it's really important to emphasise will be coming back. The work on conflict prevention will be coming back. And you're absolutely right, women are often at the centre of that work in terms of ensuring peace in communities right across the world. And are really fundamental that this government's been shy about because of their attitude domestically. We will be returning to a place where we are a champion of human rights once more, and funding human rights issues and supporting human rights activists and defenders across the globe again. And as you know, women are often at the frontier of that fight wherever we are in the world, and that's very important. And I've said this before, my father left my family when I was 12. I was raised by my mother and aunts. In some ways, my family background is a matriarchal one, not a patriarchal one, and I totally want to centre our work with women and girls. And your point is very well made. And it links to a kind of broader geopolitical point that's tough, but we have to face up to, which is in this world of China as an emerging superpower, of countries like UAE, India, Brazil, Turkey, playing a much greater role in development and a much bigger role in the leadership of global majority countries than we've seen in the past. And also in this world in which we are outside of the European Union, we do have to think harder about our USP domestically. And that means playing to our national strengths. And it's why I said before, we can no longer satisfy ourselves with the simple debate of why did we not do better to help the global south face down the pandemic with the supply of vaccines. That is not the question. The question is, with the research and higher education capacity that we have, why have we not supported those countries to have their own manufacturing capability? And it links to this point about the National Health Service, higher education, science, our strengths. We have to play to our strengths and see countries as partners in which to leave a legacy that gets them growth and gets them out of poverty and to become middle-income countries, because that's what lifts the majority of souls that we care about.
Thank you both. You can answer, whoever wants to answer. I'm Resham. I'm lucky enough to be on the CGP's Future Leaders programme. I was wondering what your thoughts are on how AI and technological advancements will help or hinder the kind of work on development and foreign diplomacy, and also, given there's been a real shift in public mood on the development argument, how you intend to win over aid skeptics and development skeptics in the coming years. Thank you.
Hi, Megan Rowland Deverell from Tier Fund. Coming back to your points on partnership and respect, I'd love to hear your kind of reflections on how the localisation agenda would fit within Labour policy. particularly not just from a funding perspective, but from local actors being seen as stakeholders with a wealth of experience, and also how local faith actors fit within that for you.
Great, thanks, Faye. So we've got one on AI and technological advances impacting development, and one on the localisation agenda. Who would like to come in on those first?
I'm hugely worried about the way that certain big powers in the world are manipulating more fragile democracies, using social media, and I suspect with big elections to come, using AI. It's very, very worrying. And it's important in foreign policy work that we don't, and obviously I can't predict what the outcome of big important elections are, but when I was in Montreal with Keir Starmer recently, at what was in the end a progressive conference with Justin Trudeau, with the leader of Norway, the leader of Finland, imagining Joe Biden winning a second term, thinking about Schulz, thinking about Macron, we understood that we can be big defenders of democracy and how AI is regulated and how we support countries not to lose out because of the race for AI. That this is hugely, hugely important. So it's a big issue. There has to be lots of thinking and work that goes into it. But what we could see is the gap widen, and then also there are the real issues around certain jobs that communities could lose. Having said that, there are huge possibilities on education, on health, on personalisation, huge possibilities, and we have to harness those and race towards those. So that does require UK leadership. When you look around the world, it's the United States and the UK particularly that have leadership in terms of AI. So there are some real possibilities.
I sort of bounced straight off that into, one of the things that we're really keen to do is to make sure that when we think about the AI revolution and the tech revolution, that we're not just supporting developing countries to have access to that technology, but that we're helping to empower them so that they are the inventors and makers of that technology as well. And that's why you'll hear quite a lot from me over the coming months about, particularly in relation to women and girls, but especially around education and opening up educational opportunities so that those young people, as Jill Biden said at an event at UNICEF that we were at in New York a few weeks ago, some of these kids are going to be the kids that go on to cure cancer. They're going to be the kids that go on to help us solve climate change. But they can't at the moment because they haven't got access to those opportunities, and we're determined to change that. It matters to them, it's the moral thing to do, but it's also the smart thing to do for the world. And I just, wanted to say, localisation agenda is absolutely my thing, so you've just hit my button and made me very happy, and I'd love to talk to some of you in this room about that more. I've gone from, sort of not lost on me that I've gone from levelling up the country to levelling up the world. And actually, that might be quite a daunting task, but the challenge is the same. People have a contribution to make, and they want to make that contribution. They want to be in charge of their own destiny, and that really matters. And that's why the relationships that we have with governments will be important, but the relationships that we have with people is going to be central as well. And just finally on this point about winning the argument about aid, so it's been about 3.5 weeks in the job, and I started off 3.5 weeks ago thinking it's very clear-cut, the self-interested argument for why we do this as a country. David talked about asylum seekers in hotels. Why are people moving? An honest conversation about immigration has to start with a conversation about poverty and climate change and conflict in countries across the world. You only have to look at what's happening with climate change. It's global pandemics. It's obvious why we need to do this work. I met with Sally Davies in New York. She was telling me about the work that she's doing on antimicrobial resistance. It is genuinely quite frightening, the use of antibiotics in food chains and the way in which immunity is starting to build up amongst the human population. These are all things that we need to do, but actually, over the course of those 3.5 weeks, I've started to change my mind a little, because I think we don't just have to win the self-interested argument, we have to win the moral argument as well. And why do I say that? Because before I came into Parliament, I worked with child refugees in this country, in some of the most marginalised, discriminated against children in Britain. We went into Yarlswood and we gathered the evidence that helped us to end briefly the immigration detention of children. We went to the Supreme Court and had laws overturned that made those families destitute so that children were starving and mums didn't know what to do. We got, with the amazing help of Ed Balls, who was a superb children's secretary, we extended the Children Act to cover those children so that they couldn't be abused and manhandled during immigration raids. We did all of those things, and then what happened? All of that progress unravelled very, very quickly after 2010. And if I have one regret from that time, it's that I thought there were shortcuts. But there are no shortcuts. I wish that I'd spent much of that decade out in the country making the case for why we're the sort of country that treats children decently and with humanity. Because I think if you can win that argument, like we won the argument over civil partnerships that led to equal marriage, like we won the argument over the minimum wage and that floor in terms of what you're paid that gives people dignity and decency and the right to live richer, larger, more dignified lives. If you win the moral argument, then you can't see the sort of damage that's been done over the last decade where that agenda is unravelled. So, you know, this guy's very good at winning an argument, and he's good at making an argument and making a principled case. And I hope so am I. And between us, you are going to hear principles restored to the heart of our approach to the world.
I hope you'll find in the work that Lisa and I will do together that we're very clear on what the role of government is once more. And so there is a little bit of challenge. It is not our job. We are not attempting to run a big NGO that's in the business of philanthropy or aid. Therefore, there does have to be some challenge. And I think that we have to move away from the internal rows that many of you know go on in your NGOs, particularly, between the policy people that often, know the right thing to do, and the marketeers that are often using images and visuals that just take us backwards. We have to do better at communicating to the population at large, where there has been progress in so many countries across the world, where it isn't the case that everyone is sitting with a swollen belly or flies flying around them, where there are skyscrapers, where there are middle-class people, where communities do send more back in remittances than governments can ever give. We have to be more generous to global majority communities and move away from some of those old-fashioned colonial models that I'm afraid do poverty alleviation over the long, sustained term no good at all. And it's our job to challenge.
We've got time for 2 more questions. So we'll take Tim there, and then if you can get it to the woman back there.
Hi, I'm Tim Ingram from WaterAid. In the words of the White House Action Plan on Global Water Security published last year, as a source of both life and livelihoods, water security is central to both human and national security. Given that the climate crisis is a water crisis with humans experiencing impacts of climate change through too much, too little, or too dirty water, and given that water security underpins food security, health security, and energy security, how will a Labour foreign policy address this global challenge that lags far behind both in investment and global cooperation?
Thank you. I've got a really practical question about your first 100 days. It was so fantastic to be in the auditorium and hear this emphasis on rebuilding and restoring and reviving. It has been a battering time for anyone in foreign policy, but especially those who are going to be tasked with delivering your vision, which is essentially the FCDO. I am a big champion of them. We work alongside them, but it has been, as you say, an act of vandalism to do such a bungled merger, to have those aid cuts, the ministerial churn. They haven't been able to do anything. So my question is, how are you going to reinvigorate? How are you going to have an FCDO that is more inclusive and more representative, that can do that work? Your last point, David, I underlined so hard. It is so welcome. But you need a different kind of Foreign Office to do it. That does no disservice to the kind of people who are really working very hard. But the structures are so rigid. How are you going to encourage the kind of vision and return to strategy that can deliver what you think Britain deserves? And the last point I'll say there is that's the cheapest thing that you can do to leverage what Britain can be in the world, because that's just smart people and smart systems. But any ideas you have about that would be really welcome. Thank you.
So we've got a question on the water and climate crisis, and then one on reinvigorating the FCDO. Do you want to come in on that one, David?
Trust me. The Labour Party has been on a journey in a very short space of time. I cautioned Keir after being the vice chair of his campaign to lead our party. I cautioned him against a plan that was a 5-year plan because I wasn't sure that we could win in one term, and wanted him to stretch it out to being a 10-year plan. He didn't take my advice. Here we are. He had to remake the party, clearly, because we were drowning in the anti-Semitism and the big issues that we had. He had to then focus us to be an effective opposition and highlight the problems with this current government. And then we had to set out a vision. We are into that third stage now. And trust me, we understand the importance of not just policy development, but how we lead. Now, the truth is, there are more announcements that we want to make over the course of the next 6 or 7 months, and a lot of them actually are in what would be traditionally seen as the development area of policy. I've focused a lot on foreign policy, as you'd understand, coming into the role, particularly with the war in Ukraine, the fallout from Afghanistan, and the changing world that we find ourselves. But there'll be a lot more said in relation to development. But trust me, there's a lot of work that you will not see that's about how we get back to leadership again. How the FCDO, which was a department that had the highest morale in Whitehall, but now has the lowest morale in Whitehall, gets back quick. We can do it. I just want you to have faith that we can do it. If we have the privilege to serve, if we win the next election, the confidence levels immediately will rise because of the agenda that we are setting out and the more to come over the coming months. And we are thinking very, very hard about how we unite, lift spirits, offer a vision again, and ensure that the FCDO is the functional beacon that it can be, not just in Whitehall, but also on the global stage. And one of the things that people keep raising with me wherever I am in the world is not just we want Britain back in the room when you're not there, it's that you guys seem to have lost your confidence. And I think, to be fair, for many officials, with the change that they've had to put up with having Boris Johnson, Dominic Raab and Liz Truss as your boss, tough. I think we can make a change very quickly.
Brilliant. So I think this point about morale is just so important. I think many of you in the sector are feeling very beleaguered, but I can absolutely tell you that that is true of civil servants as well. To have spent your life building up expertise, knowledge, the culture that existed within DFID was very much, as David said, it was one of being creative. It was one of measuring and understanding impacts, listening and understanding the priorities of people in other parts of the world and responding, not just the traditional broadcast mode that often governments can end up in. And that culture was vandalised when Boris Johnson stood up and made his speech about the giant cash point in the sky. And, you know, actually credit to Andrew Mitchell, my opposite number, because I think he has tried to salvage what he could from a department that was essentially under attack. It was, you know, it was an agenda that the government was deliberately trying to dismantle. And I think he's done quite a lot of work to help to protect what is there. But I think that we can do better than that. It starts with recognising the expertise that we have in the department, but also especially on the ground, and how well respected we are for that expertise that has been painstakingly built up over many, many years. And it's about you hearing that message loud and clear from David and from Keir and from myself. It's also about being clear about what it is that you're trying to achieve. And I understand why a lot of the debate here in the UK is about whether we reconstitute the department or whether we find another way to deliver. But actually, I think there is a prior question to that, and it is what are you trying to do? Andrew made the point to me when I went in to see him that when we left office, we were working in 33 countries. We're now working in 88 with a fraction of the budget that we once had. And I think even if you look back to the days of William Hague, when campaigning to stop sexual violence against women and girls was an obvious and clear priority, it's very difficult now to look at the international development agenda that Britain has and understand what that purpose actually is. So we're going to make choices. We're going to bring some clarity and strategic direction back to the international development work that we do. And I guess, you know, and I think I said earlier, I really respect the work that WaterAid do, and it was transformative for me to be able to meet the women in Bangladesh and Ghana who are leading that work on your behalf. But it is a little bit of a gentle pushback to those of you in this room that, you know, one of the reasons that I have such respect for the Coalition for Global Prosperity is because too often what I hear is people who have agendas that matter but seem to think that they're in competition with others, and constantly levelling questions at us about why their particular issue isn't the top priority as opposed to others. But actually, as I learnt from that young engineer in Ghana, if education of women and girls is your top priority, then one of the things you've got to think about is wash facilities. And one of the things you've got to think about is vaccinations. And one of the things you've got to think about is access to credit and getting into conflict zones very quickly in order to empower women and girls to succeed. And that's why I say I make no apology for saying that we'll bring a much clearer, more strategic approach to how we do this work in the department. And one last thing, too, is that, you know, I'm watching Gordon go about his work in New York. I mean, it's exhausting, actually, just to be around it, and it's phenomenal. But this is, you know, as David alluded to earlier, you know, from Barbara Castle to Claire Short, this is a campaigning job. This is about bringing people together, building coalitions, winning hearts and minds, and winning the argument. And I came back from those few days with a very clear sense that the work that we do doesn't start in government, it starts right now. And when we enter government, and I hope to God that we do win the trust of the people to govern again, we will hit the ground running with a civil service who know exactly what our priorities are, because they will have seen and heard it from David and myself over and over again over the coming year. We don't intend to wait for permission to government. The work starts today.
Well, that's all we're going to have time for today. So if you could join me in saying a huge thank you to Lisa and David. and also special